thanks for for inviting me. What I want to do is talk in 10 minutes about something like a speculative history of live coding. Where does this whole concept come from, and where it might even come from without most people being aware of. I think that the actual term live coding was coined by the British software artist Alex McLean. And he first used it for a practice that was very punk-like, or, well, Jabber-like, because what he actually did is he opened a couple of terminal windows on his Linux laptop, opened the Emacs editor, which is a standard Unix editor, and live coded some Perl routines which were generating very rough Jabber-style beat sounds, and then he was just changing the parameters in the source code, saving the files so that the sounds would change, and that was his performance, which he also performed together with Alex McLean and other British software artists. So this is where it comes from, and I think it has a lot of potential because, first of all, it really challenged the classical divide between an artist and a programmer that is very common in digital arts, and which I think is very unfortunate, that you have an artist or a designer who comes up with an idea, and then you have a programmer, slave, or technician who's implementing it, and often that leads to misunderstandings or failed projects or limited potential of those works. It's also a challenge to the divide between coding and performance. Michel has mentioned that in his introduction. It also challenged the divide between so-called generative and so-called non-generative or performance art. So suddenly these categories are in a flux. I think also what I really like about the initial Alex McLean performances is that they're really low-tech, so it's not programming as a black art or high craftsmanship, but really as a kind of populist, low-tech practice, well, similar to a poetry slam, I would almost say. Yeah? It's like you start with something like poetry, and which has, over the centuries, become a very refined, almost aristocratic art, and you have a poet who writes something, and then maybe you have actors or professional recitators who recite the poetry, and then somebody comes in and just makes a kind of improvised poetry slam in order to bring back like original material qualities to poetry. I also think it's really closer to true interactivity because there is the strong performance element in live coding, so it's about social interaction, and I think this is what true interactivity is about. It's never something that is the same as machine feedback, and I think it's the real problem of interactive art that it completely mixes up interaction with machine feedback. So this is a good example of you cannot replace the live code over the machine in that performance, and that I think is a very substantial part of it. On the other hand, you can say live coding, and now, well, you cannot see too much on that screenshot, but it's actually a screenshot, terminal screenshot of the GNU debugger, the GDB, and you can say live coding on a technical way is what every professional programmer does, namely the so-called debugging means that you try to find an error in a computer program by executing it in real time, step by step, and you can interrupt it at any stage, and then you can check what the program is currently doing, which kind of data it generates, and if you see that there is an error, then you see, there is the error in this line of my program. So you can say debugging is actually also live coding, yeah, in a technical sense. So why then care about live coding in digital arts if it's something like debugging? Well, you can find a hint on Alex McLean's own website, and there you see also the extent of historical reflection. This is a musical score that was created by Swedish musicians, composers collective called Click Nielsen in 1975. And what you see, it's actually a performance score, yeah? But it's a kind of recursive or self-reflexive performance score. So it says, well, the first instructions is you may add a new instruction to your list or modify an existing one. Second, delete. You may delete one instruction from your list. Third, exchange one instruction list with another player of your choice. They must defer but may choose which set to exchange. with you if they have more than one. And so on and so on. Sonification, and it's for a sound performance, for an instrumental performance. But what really happens here is that a very classical genre of European art, namely the score, the musical score, suddenly becomes an area of live coding. Yeah? And now I think that the link between music and programming is not at all coincidental or metaphorical, because in the European cultural tradition, it really started with Pythagoras and his equation of the octave with a arithmetic division by 2, so that there was an analogy of mathematical laws and musical laws, and up to the Middle Ages, up to the Renaissance, music in universities was actually taught as part of the canon of the sciences. It was grouped together with mathematics, geometry, and astronomy in one area of arts or sciences, and not with the humanities. That's a relatively recent concept. So why was that the case? Yeah, because if you think of classical European score notation, it's a lot actually like a programming language. Yeah? Because it is a formal instruction code. If you wish, the composer is something like a programmer, and then you have instrumentalists who are something like executioners of the piece, and the connection becomes really non-metaphorical but very literal if you think of musical automata, like for example the player piano, the mechanical pianos which work with piano rolls. There, the piano roll really is a code. It really is a written program, well, it's not coincidental because actually modern computing comes out of a tradition. First of all, the textile industry and the kind of machine instructions that were used there, and then also piano rolls pretty much built a prehistory of modern computing. So you could say live coding in terms of music is something like a score, a formal score, but a formal score that is not fixed but gets modified in real time. And what I'm projecting here is a really early example for that in 20th century music. It is the Variations No. 2 by John Cage from 1958. And actually, what you can see is that these lines and circles, these lines and dots, are actually on a set of transparent foils. Well, first of all, it's up to the performer to interpret what these lines and dots actually mean, how to perform them, how to translate them into a musical performance. But most importantly, and that's just what I unfortunately cannot show, is that the score is not fixed in itself, but since it's these 3 transparent foils, you can arrange them in any way you want. So you can actually move those lines and move those dots. So it's a dynamic score in itself. So in that way, the musician, the performer, already becomes a co-author, a modifier of a score. You could call it an interactive score with some strings attached. And I think there's actually a pretty straightforward historical line from that to the more recent live coding practices. A composer who was very closely linked to John Cage was Christian Wolff, the same generation as John Cage, and you see him here together with Morton Feldman. Morton Feldman is on the left and Christian Wolff is on the right. The two, John Cage or Brown, really formed one school of composing of so-called indeterministic music. But I think that of those 4 composers, Christian Wolff was really the most radical in his vision of, if you want live coding. This is a quote from him. What he wants to do is to turn the making of music into a collaborative and transforming activity, performer into composer, into listener, into composer, into performer, etc. The cooperative character of the activity to the exact source of the music, to stir up through the production of the music a sense of social conditions in which we live and how these might be changed. It is very political. He was very much on the left wing. He was socialist, if not communist, and additionally politicized in the 1960s. So his idea is really, well, just like a Marxist is thinking about the relation between employer and worker, you also have to think about the relation between boss and worker in musical composition, namely the composer and the musicians. Of course, this runs historically parallel then to another practice of non-composed, non-fixed musical performance. Namely, here, this is the record which gave birth to the word free jazz by Ornette Coleman, a collective improvisation. The element is very strong. It's almost like a manifesto, this record cover. And what is also, I think, very significant is the cover art, the little square there. If you enlarge it, see it's actually a painting by Jackson Pollock. So the idea is that of a free musical practice, but I think that shows also the limitations of it in linking it to live coding, because the idea was really, it's non-formal, it's non-restricted, we do not work with instructions. Whereas the experimental scores by Christian Wolff or John Cage really worked with this duality of improvisation and predetermination of coding and then adaptation of that coding. This is also well, one of the most important music collectives who practiced that duality of improvisation and yeah, they call it live composing actually. And this is why I have to talk about it today. It was the British music collective AMM. And actually they were performing in Rotterdam just a couple of months ago at Worm. Yeah? Maybe some of you saw that. And AMM, actually I think they even tried to play with Ornette Coleman. They also tried to play with Paul McCartney. But they both found that they were too preconditioned by their respective musical styles, be it jazz music or be it pop music. So their idea was really to reinvent the musical language, and the important part of that group was the British composer Cornelius Cardew, who was a student of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, but then very much turned against his teacher and was ultimately speaking up against the Western musical tradition. Another such group well, was centered around the pianist Frederick Rzewski, John Teitelbaum and Alvin Curran. Actually, all these collectives are linked. Rzewski is a very important pianist who played John Cage and Morton Feldman. If you go even to Donner and look at the music section, John Cage, you will probably find many records performed by Rzewski. But Rzewski was also playing with the AMM collective and later with I just have like with the Cornelius Cardew, and Cornelius Cardew, after dropping out of AMM, founded a new project, the Scratch Orchestra. It's not related to musical scratching as we know it from rap and hip hop, but this term was coined in 1970, and which is one, let's say, of the big unknown, but perhaps most influential musical projects of the 20th century avant-garde, because it combined both professional musicians and amateurs, or people who couldn't even play an instrument, and both composers and both improvisers. And part of that group were Michael Nyman and Brian Eno. And so there was also the idea of crossing the boundaries between improvisation and composing in this collective, and also linked to a very strong left-wing 1960s political agenda. Yeah? Rzewski, Scratch Orchestra, AMM, Christian Wolff, they all were political radicals and really thought about not only reinventing music, but also reinventing politics and society through the way music was played. Oh yeah, that's it. I thought I forgot something. A little thing, if you can look it up, the playing strategies by, the oblique strategies by Brian Eno, which is a set of card decks with little instructions for performance. And that is directly derived from his own practice with the Scratch Orchestra. And to wind back very quickly, I think, so if you go to Click Nielsen, back to that Swedish group, you can see how their approach of you could say, mutating score was really the historical result of that tradition of the musical avant-garde that was sketching, that was going from John Cage to the Scratch Orchestra. But you could say the blind spot of John Cage and others was that they didn't thoroughly think about the control of the scores. Yeah? Even with the transparency of John Cage, he made those transparent. Whereas here, it gets more radical in the sense that the score itself can be rewritten. And I think this is just what we are going to see in various instances also tonight. Theatrical performance, multimedia performance, musical performance, that is working exactly with those paradigms, just translated into computer software, and then that link, I think, hopefully can be self-evident in what you see.